Good morning. This is part 2 of 10 in the Learning and Math webinar series on Dimension 2 of the 2022 Minnesota Math Standards. And I am Sara Vanderwerf. I'm the MDE Academic Standards Mathematics Specialist. And I'm excited to be with you today because I was with you 2 weeks ago when we did part 1, and I told you 2 stories about my youth. That webinar is recorded up on MCTM's YouTube channel. And I told you about my mom saving money, and I told you about my dad helping us sort checks, and I told you that context mattered. And today I'm going to tell you 2 other stories about my life. And so I'm going to start with, and both of them are meant to set up this idea that context matters in mathematics. And so I'm going to start with this picture. This was taken just a week or 2 ago, and it was texted to my family by a high school friend of my family. This is, we call her Pee Wee Lisa, and she's with my dad, and she saw my dad. And you looking at this picture, you might not see what I see. This is the text that she sent. She said, "Look who I spotted after my dentist appointment this afternoon." And she spotted him and she went over and took a picture with him. But what I see is this is a picture from the same week at my mom's 80th birthday. Is my sister and I are holding my dad up because 3 years ago, my dad had a stroke. And he was in a wheelchair for the first part of that. This is him getting therapy at his house all the time. When he had his stroke, he would go in for therapy because my dad was born with cerebral palsy, and he can't, at this point in his life, use either arm effectively or either leg. Most people like my father would be in some type of or not home health care, some type of extended care, and living in some type of home of some sort. But my dad has a lot of persistence and has worked. And this is 2 years ago when they got to go home, still in a wheelchair. And he started again playing games with some of his friends. And then he moved up to what he liked to call his rollator. And it gave him a little more freedom, but he goes really, really, really slowly. He needs to be helped all the time because, again, neither leg or arm works super well. And then they got him this taller rolling thing, and he can go a lot faster, but a lot faster for my dad is a super slow pace for me, but it's been really effective. We moved them into a townhome. This is him at Father's Day. It allows him to stand a little taller and do a few more things, but he still needs quite a bit of help. And he'll call me at work sometimes after therapy, and he's starting to walk with a harness on and 2 walking sticks. And he'll be like, "I went 102 feet today, and it took him a lot of energy and I didn't fall." And he's so excited, and he keeps working out all these, 3 years later. I'm really proud of him. This year at the state fair, this is our family. We decided, because his hands have gotten good enough to work a scooter, to rent a scooter for the first time in his life. And it was the first time in 3 years he had some independence to, at the fair, go where he wanted when we didn't have to be right there with him. My mom, who's been his caretaker, didn't have to be right there with him. And my only frustration with him is he was going too fast for me. And then we decided to rent one right after the state fair for a month to see if it's something that would give him something he could do at home. And he really liked this. This is him in his neighborhood. It was a little small for him, and it was hard for him to get in with that bar, but he started going on daily trips around the neighborhood, and he would go and visit neighbors. He'd just drive up and start talking to them. That's my dad, the extrovert. And then yesterday, my parents bought a new scooter that's foldable that you can put in a car. They need to buy a lift, but they had to buy a brand new car yesterday as well. But when I see this picture that my friend Pee Wee posted of my dad, you maybe see my dad sitting there, but that was the first sense of freedom my dad has had, because he left his house, went to a busy street in his neighborhood, and just watched the cars. And he texted his mom, "I don't know when I'll be home. I'm watching the cars on Zane Avenue." And so context matters in the stories of our life. If you just see the pictures, you don't know the story behind the pictures. Here's another picture from my life. My mom's family is from Norway, Ingvik, Norway, to be exact. My sister and her husband were there recently. Isn't it beautiful? This is Ingvik. And we have a family farm that's been in the family since the 1500s. There's still family living on this farm. They raise sheep in the fjords. of Norway, and then somehow they immigrated to the plains of South Dakota and were farmers there. But they post on the family Facebook page regularly. And one time someone posted, "Hey, there's a traffic jam." And when you see the shape in the world, I'm sure that is a traffic jam for them. But I live on 35W. I live in the city. And when I say traffic jam, this is what I'm envisioning in my head. So depending on your context, depending on the story of your life, your lived experience, how you view even words is related to the context, and context matters. Why am I talking about context so much? Because I'm doing a webinar series on the second dimension in the new 2022 math standards that will be fully implemented in the 27-28 school year. And there are 5 contexts that students must be learning math in. And this is the second of 10 parts of that webinar series. And today we're going to talk about a little bit about what it means to learn math in context. And this is a huge deal because it's 1/3 of the rigor stool that overlays our entire thing, which says 1/3 of our intensity in the classroom, 1/3 of the students' experiences, 1/3 of our planning should be on creating experiences for students to engage in appropriate concepts and skills so they can tackle real world problems. And so that should be 1/3 of our students' work because, in our decision making, this is one of the 3 decision making questions of our new standards. What are authentic opportunities that exist for application of our benchmarks to real world problems? So that's why we're doing this webinar series. It's 1/3 of your future work. And so we want to be serious about why it's important to learn math in context. In my last webinar, I showed you how what my mom and dad had done with me when I was young was related to standards and benchmarks in the new benchmarks. I had been learning percentages in my lived experiences from a very young child. So when I got to 6th grade, it was easy. And then at the end of the session, I brought up this question with a bike, and we're going to solve this by the end of this. And I talked about how a lot of adults even don't like fractions and are worried, like, how am I going to support students in being successful in solving something like this? And we talked about why we should learn math in context. And I gave you 6 reasons in that webinar. You can go back and watch it. Everything is linked. I have it linked in the chat if you're live, but things are linked down below in the description of the recording. Everything that I'm sharing with you can be found in the folders that exist in these files. Everything is linked. My PowerPoint and everything is located in there. So today we're going to look at this, and we're going to spend several sessions answering, is this thing a context? And are word and story problems the same as context? So we're going to continue thinking about this problem and thinking about those questions, but we're really going to talk about context mattering. And a lot of people think context doesn't matter because they think we contrive and make up problems that don't really exist in the world. There's all kinds of memes about them that you can find online where people are complaining or making fun about math. This is a classic one where people talk about no one goes to the grocery store and buys 60 watermelons and wonders why. So I want to give you one definition for context that we're going to use. It refers to real world situations, narratives, or background information that gives meaning to the math concepts and makes it relevant to students. So let's explore that. But before we explore it, I just want to bring up a lot of work that Dan Meyer has been doing since 2010 on what the intersection of real world math and interesting math for students. And when we think about watermelons, you certainly could make an argument that watermelons are in the real world, but it's not always interesting to students. And a lot of times, Dan Meyer, he has a whole TED Talk that came out in 2010. I have it linked if you haven't watched it. I'm not going to show it to you now. It's what made him famous. And he was talking about math class needs makeover. And then he blogged about all of this stuff and he called it fake mathematics. And he talked about the context that we use. We should be using context, but it's important to situate those math ideas in everyday real world or even sometimes imaginary or geometric situations and contexts. And that's going to be one of the representations that we connect all the other parts of mathematics to. All of these things are important. And so we're going to be thinking about context in relationship to those things as well. So in our front matter of our standards, it says all of our students should be learning math in order to expand their professional opportunities and understand and critique their world. When our students leave the K-12 system, they're not going to be doing a lot of naked math problems. A lot of the math they're going to be doing is going to be in the context of their work or in their life. And so they should have those experiences and build the skills that they need so that they can experience the joy and wonder and beauty of mathematics. So in our standards, we have 5 contexts. We're going to have webinars on each of these. Today, we're going to talk more generally about why context matters. So one of my favorite people to follow on Instagram is Chris Snow. You should be following him. I didn't check this morning, but as of yesterday, he was on day 31 of a series on Instagram. I have his Instagram account linked where he is comparing 100 to numbers. He started with 100, comparing it to 101. Are they approximately equal? And he said he's going to keep posting every day until everyone agrees he's gone too far. And so yesterday was on a day 131. He hasn't stopped yet, but I took some pictures a week or two ago when he was on 124. And he has polls up and thousands of people are responding to his polls. And he's asking, have I gone too far? And they are saying, a lot of them are saying yes, but not everybody. And so he has not stopped. There are 31% of people that's saying 100 is approximately equal to 124. And so the next day when he posted is 100 approximately equal to 125, I think the most interesting part of his posts are all the comments on Instagram. Somebody said, we have a ways to go before I think it's too far. When are you stopping? So this stops when it's at 100%? Yes. Nah, you've gone too far now. 25% was my limit. At this point, it's unignorable. Even engineers can't round this off anymore. 25% is a lot. I'm not saying yes until day 151. If I'm going to eat ice cream and it's 125 calories instead of 100, I wouldn't care. You haven't gone too far. If I got an hour and 15 minutes of sleep instead of my usual 1 hour of sleep, I probably wouldn't notice. And so what he started to notice is that people's decision if he has gone too far are related to story. Context matters and story matters. And so he posted a reel at a day 110 and he said, here's what I thought was going to happen. I thought I would get this comment all the time, and here I did. This is a Minnesota person who happens to live in Wisconsin now. And she said, what's your unit? And he said, I thought people would say, but like, me walking 100 miles versus 110 miles is a lot. Yeah, you've gone too far. But if it had been 100 and 110 millimeters and I was going for a walk, nah, it wouldn't matter. Those are pretty close to one another. And so he gave lots of ideas, and I've linked to all of his reels and his Instagram, so you can go and hear this whole thing. I just took some screenshots of it. He said there are stories behind this number. And this 100 and 110 can be, when you put it in the context of something, it changes how you view that problem. By the way, he does have a point of stopping. He doesn't need 100%. It's the percentage of people that say yes compared to what the voting is. We're getting close, but he hasn't stopped yet. Context and story matter. Here's another context. This one was super controversial several years ago. It is a true statement that 1 + 1 is, in fact, 2 within the system of standard arithmetic. But, however, outside of that specific system, there are several contexts where 1 and 1 does not equal 2. Social media did not like this idea of 1 and 1 not equaling 2. And so I'm going to give you some examples of when 1 and 1 doesn't equal 2. One is in the realm of science, when you mix liquids. And if you have water and alcohol and you mix equal amounts of them, it turns out you don't double the volume. The volume is slightly less than 2 liters. There's some type of chemical reaction where the molecules sneak in and hide amongst each other. And it's true that in this science contact, 1 and 1 is not equal to 2. In fact, it's less than 2. Those labels and stories and the context matter. In this binary system, if we look at 1 and 1, does that equal 2? The binary system codes a lot of things in computers, and those numbers that are in our system are replaced with numbers instead of powers of 10 in our base 10 number system, powers of 2. And so the number 2 becomes the binary code of 1, 0. So 1 plus 1 in binary is 1, 0. It is not 2. There is no 2 in the binary code. And in business, they use a phrase 1 and 1 makes 3. It's sometimes used in successful mergers that say that the value of 2 combined companies is greater than the sum of its individual parts. So it's 1 and 1 equal to 3. Will story and context matter? And so our students are going to do math and context. So one of my favorite mathematicians, she's out of the researcher out of the University of Chicago, I think. She's from Chicago. And I've posted, you should go watch them, a session that she gave, and also a podcast that just came out in the last week because she has a new book that's out. She's written several books. And she's been on national news stories talking about math. And she says math isn't about memorizing the right answers. It's actually about thinking deeply and seeing differently. And so as an example, she talked about the definition of circle. I think we can all agree that this is the definition of a circle. And then she said, but we can change the context of things. And then this definition takes on a different character. She goes on to explain, if I ask you to find the distance between points A and B, a lot of us mathematicians would bring out our friend Pythagoras and we'd draw in a right triangle. And we'd be like, oh, I got a 3, 4, 5 right triangle. A squared plus B squared equals 25 squared, C squared. Take the square root of that, I get 5. And that's what's also known as the crow's distance, the shortest distance between those 2 points. The distance is 5. But in the real world, the distance is usually not 5 because we're not crows. And there's what's called the taxi cab distance. If these were streets in a city or in a town, in order to get from point A to point B, I would have to go a distance of 7. And that's also a valid distance in a different context. So context and story matter. I'm not going to tell you the punchline to what she said. You can go watch it. But she has me convinced that this picture is indeed a circle under the same definition, because the context changed and she explained mathematically, and this was not even a real world context. This was simply an abstract mathematical context that changes things. Her new book, by the way, is called Unequal. There's even quotes from St. Paul-based Minnesota math author Ben Orlin recommending her books. So context and story matter. So when we're thinking about what's going on in our classroom, we have all kinds of students, and I taught in schools where they were changing all the time. And as we're thinking about that 1/3 of intensity that we need to bring to teaching in context, one of the things that I want to encourage you is that you need to start by studying your students and learning your students. Where are your students from? Maybe your student was born in South Dakota or in Florida or somewhere else in the world, and they bring that with them into the classroom. They bring into the classroom things that they love. Like my nephews right now who live in Minneapolis, city bounds, love fishing. Yesterday, my brother and my oldest nephew were out on the Mississippi. What are the things our students love? What are the contexts that they might in their current life be using it in their world? And then we need to think about who their families are and what we know about their families, what their families love to do, what they love to eat, how they like to be. And then we think about the neighborhood that they live in. I live in Northeast Minneapolis. My brother and his children live in South Minneapolis. Those are different neighborhoods. They have different vibes. There's different things that are exciting to them. And then we think about the greater context of our city or our towns and what we know about those. I know some of you, your town is your neighborhood, but for some of us, that's a different thing. And then as we're going along, we think about the region of our state. If you're in the southwest corner of the state, that's a different experience than the northeast corner of our state. And we think about the state as a whole. In Minnesota, a lot of our students reside in Minnesota. If you were born in Minnesota, you might be a Vikings fan. And as we think about the greater context of our country and the things that we care about in our country and in the world, and sometimes we think, why do I need to worry about our country and our world? my kids, everybody in our town stays in our town. We don't know that for sure. And they interact with the world even through social media and other places. And a lot of them are going to go and live in other places. So we want to expand throughout K-12 the experiences for our students. Here's what a Minnesota education leader said to me recently. Sara, we have to start at the micro level. Our students' lens informs us how they engage and connect with math. And so that's where we start in this idea of context mattering and learning math in context. So we need to study our students, and that's what's going to happen in session 3. How do we do that? And then we go to the macro level and look at the broader context of how we as a society understand how math shapes the way we live and see the world. And so that's the goal of a lot of the rest of this series, because our students need to have experiences in their lived experience first so that we can formalize the math later. And so I'm going to give you an example from my classroom. I taught 7th grade, but I often would want to review really quickly 6th grade material so I could connect it to 7th grade material. And so when I was wanting to build proportional reasoning skills in 7th grade, I would look at these are the 2022 standards, 6th grade benchmarks on ratio, and I would be like, how can I review that in my class? And there's a really cool, I have it linked in the description, set of problems called Mullet Math that build both of these standards. And Mullet Math asks you to find the most mullety of all mullets, and they have a ratio where they compare the party in the back to the business in the front. And then you also design mullets that would have a ratio of 4 and other things, and students are really motivated. But when I chose this lesson, I actually was thinking about the students I was teaching in Minneapolis and in the state of Minnesota. And here's what I know about the state of Minnesota. We don't have mullets. We have a state hockey tournament. And at that state hockey tournaments, our hockey players change their hairs for the tournament, because when they announce the starting lineups that are sponsored by Great Clips, they want to get in the top 10 hockey hairdos at the fair or at the state tournament. And so in our state, even when I was a kid in the 80s, in high school in the 80s, we called this hockey hair. We didn't call this mullets. So we changed this to mullet ratios and talked about what mullets are the most mullety. And if you're like, this hasn't gone away, the answer is no. This is my nephew from last week. He loves hockey. He's in 5th grade. Not the greatest picture, but I was trying to get a side view of him, and he is rocking a mullet. I don't know if it's the most mullety, but it's a hockey hair. It's not a mullet in the state of Minnesota. Anyways, context and story matter in this case. And my goal in doing this is that we need to be considering the context, but the context is not alone. The context needs to be connected to things that are physical, manipulatives, visual, symbolic, and verbal. And there are definitions of each of these things if you haven't seen these multiple representations. And this is not new. Contextual situations, math ideas in everyday real world, imaginary, and geometric situations. This is part of the 8 effective evidence-based practices in math, the 8 instructional practices, and one of them, to create meaningful discourse, we need to use and connect mathematical representations, and context is one of those reputations. And I believed in this so much when I was the K-12 math lead in a district I worked in. All 200 secondary math teachers were given a laminated poster that looks something like this. You can still go to that district and see that. And we talked a lot about how the arrows in the middle were the most important picture part of this visual, because research has shown, and this is, by the way, some of this research was done in Minnesota, strengthening the ability of our students to move among these representations, moving from contexts like hockey hair, ratios, improves the students' growth and their understanding of concepts. So as we think about context and connecting it to all these other things, I'm going to show you another example where the graph is really important. So here's a graph. This is not in a context right now. And for students to look at this, they're just like, oh, coordinates, which one's the X, which one's the Y? I always forget which axis is what axis. But if we put this into a context of people, and this is an old school context from Malcolm Swan, still one that a lot of people use today. We have all these people And then we put it side by side, that graph and that context side by side. Students, our teacher questions are those arrows. Students' job is to build connections between these two things and make meaning of these two things. There's a context of people and ages, and the student's job is to make meaning out of that context and compare it to that graph and the height of those things. When we talk about context and story matter, our students understand math through the use of context. Why do I know context matters? Because when this was posted by Minnesota author Ben Orland this week about how sparsely populated Alaska is, one person per square mile compared to the US is 94 people per square mile. And he said, what does this mean? He said, get rid of everybody in the United States and just take the state of Kentucky and spread it out. That's what the United States would feel like if it was Alaska. And a math leader and my friend from Kentucky was super excited about it. In fact, she later shared it with all her Kentucky friends, because when we see ourselves in math, it excites us and we want to talk about this. So think about the things in your life, in your students' life. I love to bake and I also love math. So when my mom turned 75, this is what the cakes I made for her look for like. When we were celebrating her 80th last week, my sister made lefse for the big party that we threw. Think of all the math that we could bring into our classroom with this. There's a number talk there, how many. There's amount of potatoes that she used in ratio to other ingredients. And think about what's going on in your neighborhood. You might think this is in the redwoods of California, but no, this is in South Minneapolis. There's my hockey hair nephew next to a tree in his neighborhood that got cut down. What are the opportunities for us thinking about math and the things that are in our neighborhoods, in our students' lives, in our families' lives, in our states and our countries? And so that's what we're going to explore in session 3. But I wanted to end by telling you that if you, my slides are there, you can go and look at all 7 anchor standards. I've given you some beginning ideas at different grade levels of what the context of these things might look like. This is just a short webinar. And again, you can find the link to all these things in the description below. And so for every single one of them, I just gave you some beginning ideas that connect to some things you might find in there, because at the end of all our benchmarks, they recommend one of the contexts that we should do that learning in. So let's look at a standard. This is a typical math problem that we would see. I told you in the last webinar that a lot of adults and a lot of students just randomly pick an operation. But even if they could write a number, an expression, a mathematical expression to solve that, they still often are just guessing at what they should do. And so it's really important not to only have naked number problems and not only to have things in context, but build in students the ability to solve this problem. Because here's how I was taught, and here's how I taught it for a lot of ways. Ours is not to reason why, ours is to but, invert, and multiply. And then we got to turn it into an improper fraction, and then we multiply those fractions. By the way, this is a lot of different tiny skills that you got to remember. And then I got to turn it back into a mixed fraction, and I got to do some long division, and then I get 8 remainder 1. But what is that remainder 1? I'd be super happy if they remembered that remainder 1 was 1 and 1/4. So I get an answer, but students don't even have an idea to estimate if that is right or wrong. And that's why we use things in context. And in our new standards, this is Anchor Standard 5, and here's some benchmarks that go with this problem. And those benchmarks have real world context at the end of them and say, yes, you should be learning this in the real world. And they talk about how you should be using visual models and solving mathematical situations and doing these problems. So what's a mathematical model? I'm almost done, I promise you. An example is a tape diagram. It's my favorite mathematical model because it works from kindergarten all the way up until like 8th grade, solving systems of equations. And you can not even worry about all that stuff that I showed you. If you know the progression of tape diagrams, and I linked this document that we shared in a summer training on Anchor Standard 5, you can look at this and break up this problem into parts. I always start with a question because the question often defines the whole. How long is her entire length of her trip? And I just draw a rectangle. That's a bar model. That's a tape diagram. And then the red says she traveled 2/3 of her length. So I break it up into 2/3. And then it says that 2/3 is 5.5. And then I'm like, I have a picture of what this is. So I'm going to split that 5.5 in a part. So I'm dividing the 5.5 into 2 parts. And then I'm like, that other third must be there. So I have 3 sets of 2.5 plus, a quarter. And then if I add all of that up, her entire trip is 8 2/5. That's how I solved this problem. If you're good with bar modeling with tape diagrams, it's probably how you solved it. If you want to make sense of those things that we say, ours is not to reason why, start in a context, build meaning through visual models, because context and story matter. And application is called for in the standards. So I know you guys are like, my students can't read things like this. I have webinars on how you support the reading in your classroom. I highly recommend starting with the 3 reads routine. I have those linked. And at the next session, we're going to talk about this task that you saw there. And we're going to see it because it was written about in an article that I have linked. I highly recommend reading it. And I'm going to tell you the story of the best math teacher I've ever seen teach. And this article is about a Minnesota teacher. And I'm going to tell you that story in session 3. So thank you for coming with this morning. If you're live, I'll stick around and answer some questions. But everything in this session is linked there. And I'm really glad that you came and joined us this morning. I realize I've had chocolate on my teeth the whole time. Luckily, there's small circles.